Okay, we're live. I'm joined today by Dr. Steve Turley, the host of Turley Talks, one of the fastest growing YouTube political channels and an increasingly important source of information on the growing nationalist populist movement worldwide. And I have to say personally that I have been following Dr. Turley for a long time. Turley Talks has become one of my absolute favorite channels. I've always been impressed by how much information I get from Steve's channel, and also by the upbeat, positive message that you get on Turley Talk. Some of the people on the dissident right have a kind of a "woe is us" or Eeyore-like outlook, but Steve is always very optimistic and positive, and so I am absolutely delighted to have him today talk to us.
Thanks,
Welcome.
Robert. It's great to be here. Thank you. It's great to be here. I promise I won't be Eeyore for you.
Thank you very much. Anyway, well, the reason I wanted to interview today is that I don't know your backstory at all. And so I'm really curious about your own political journey and how and why you got involved in YouTube punditry. And then I wanted to kind of probe your political beliefs for us normies or former normies. And, who are still struggling to figure out this new political landscape. So why don't we begin with just, kind of how you got involved with the nationalist populist movement and kind of where you were originally and how you changed, or if you did change or whatever.
Oh, it's a great question. I'll try to truncate what can often be a long and boring story for you. But basically, when I was in music conservatory in Baltimore back in the 1990s, I really did have a spiritual conversion, a born again experience, and it was largely through the Christian Coalition and through the religious right political involvement. And I, from the very beginning, therefore, of my Christian life, I have always understood Christianity in very social terms and political terms and cultural terms.
Mm-hmm.
And that's ebbed and flowed over the years, but that's kind of, I think, where it began. I think I was always fascinated by politics in general as just a kid. But then when I came to faith, I began to see politics from a much more of I think a larger historical horizon, going all the way back, the Byzantine period and medieval periods and the like, and also saw it from a very vibrant moral foundation, which was in stark contrast to what I was holding to beforehand. I was very liberal back in those days, hardcore lib. But
hardcore lib. What was your parents' political background? Were you Democrats, Republicans? What?
Yeah, so I was raised in a beautiful, lovely little town in Connecticut. But Connecticut is part of the Northeast. That's the bluest of the blue in the like the Pacific Northwest. And so I've always had much more democratic, liberal leanings in my background. But smacked with punctures of conservative grace throughout. Particularly my grandfather, my father's side, he was a profoundly gifted musician. He was a scientist by profession, but he's a profoundly gifted classical musician. Loved art, Rembrandt and the like. And so I grew up with a very classical conception of life, both musically, artistically, aesthetically, that was profoundly rooted in Christian faith. And so no matter how liberal I got, there was always this sort of invasive kind of traditional moral conception of life that kept stalking me. And I never quite got rid of it until I surrendered to it. And then it became my life from that frame forward. And so then when I ended up getting into doctoral studies, back in the 2000s, 2007, I believe, 2006, 2007, I was doing doctoral studies through Durham University in England, and I came across a field of study known as post-secular studies. And that was fascinating to me because I thought we were just living in a, just a permanently secular state of things. And I found a whole field of scholarship that was dedicated to trying to figure out why religion was making such a massive comeback. And so I got very fascinated with that field of study, and then came across another field of study known as globalization studies, Anthony Giddens and the like, and then started reading his detractors, people like Hutchinson or Stepan Mostrovich, who were arguing that no, the world was not going more globalist, it was going more nationalist and populist. And that's where I started coming across this notion of re-traditionalization and the idea that cultures were re-embracing their customs and their traditions and their religions as mechanisms of resistance against globalization. And then I went back to the post-secular studies because now I know why we're getting more religious.
What was your what was your PhD in? What field?
It was an anthropological reading of the New Testament. So I got into studying baptism and the Lord's Supper in the letters of Paul through the lens.
It's theology.
Exactly, yeah, through the lens of cultural anthropology. So it was this very interesting sort of interface between New Testament and early Christianity on the one hand, and then just this dynamic analysis of anthropology, sociology, cultural studies on the other. And then when they started knocking sparks off of each other there, I started finding that there was knocking sparks all over the place, including current political trends as well.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. So in terms of your political, in terms of your background as a Yankee conservative, sort of, or not a Yankee conservative, but as a liberal in a blue state, but still having very traditionalist values because of that kind of New England. I don't know how to describe it. I've always kind of felt it, but I've never known how to describe it. But kind of a natural conservatism in New England. Was there ever any time when you felt that your political beliefs were at odds with this kind of your basic family outlook? Or in other words, was there ever any tension there between that? Did you adopt a kind of a liberal outlook in college that was in conflict with what your parents thought and things like that?
No, I think in many respects, the liberalism I embraced in college was an extension of where my parents were coming from. My father passed away when I was young, when I was 11. So I didn't really get to know him from a political vantage point. My mom has always been pretty liberal in that sense. So she's not a radical or anything like that, but she's very comfortable center left. There's no question there. My mom is a brilliant woman. She was one of the few women to ever get an MIT back in the day. I mean, this is back in what, in the in the late 50s, early 60s. She's a brilliant woman and really a hero of mine. But we're on very different islands politically speaking now, because I think she's seeing one side of the dialectic, which is the globalist liberal side. I'm seeing the other side of a dialectic, which is the nationalist populist blowback. I've camped in that blowback, being the fact that it embraces tradition, whereas her view really sees religion and tradition as irrelevant and not necessary. And so in many respects, when I embraced liberalism in college in a music conservatory among the arts and croissant crowd, as it were, I was really embracing kind of the extension of not only my mom, but indeed the public school that I was going to, many of the teachers there. The first time I ever heard a lecture on why homosexuality was good and beautiful was from a teacher in high school, and then of course I went to a music conservatory, and I ran into a lot of that kind of lifestyle. It's disproportionately represented in the arts, and I just embraced the normalcy of it. And I found anybody who would argue for a traditionalist conception of life just needed to to get their head examined and recognize that the world is evolving, and that a liberal conception of life governed by scientific rationalism on one hand and globalist technology and telecommunication on the other was inevitable. And that's where we're going. And you just might as well make your peace with it, or else forever be on the periphery of society.
Well, I think there's interesting points of contact, though, because my parents too were Democrats. It was kind of tribal. We were Irish Catholics, but they were basically suspicious of corporations. And my father was an attorney or a judge, or still is, I guess. And but I find that, you know, people on the so-called dissident right are starting to listen to some of that, in the sense that they're starting to realize that some of these international corporations might not be their friends. And so after going through this phase of libertarianism that many of us went through as kind of a chemotherapy to overcome the statism that we were raised in, a lot of us are recovering libertarians because we realize that the international corporations don't necessarily have our best interests at heart. And that's sort of part of what's behind populism. And I find that in many ways, that's a point of commonality with some of old-fashioned Democrats who have always been suspicious of corporations and think that they're a little bit predatory and so on. Do you have any thoughts on that? Are there points of commonality that some of these older Democrats and modern populists can agree on? Or
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In many respects, the fact that Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, and Pennsylvania voted Republican in 2016 for the first time since 1988. So one of them, if I recall, Iowa was back in 1984. The very fact that they did that, in many respects, is the shall we say, it is the fruits of what Pat Buchanan was arguing all the way back then.
Yes.
Which is our hope. Is it right? Our hope is in what he was telling Nixon back in the day. Our hope is in the Southern Protestant and the Northern Catholic. And being a good Irish Catholic man himself, he recognized that it was the blue-collar worker that was going to be the foundation for a new populist, realigned Republican Party. Away from sort of the Rockefeller elite, and instead re-embracing, as it were, the common man, the heartland American. This is what is driving the nationalist parties all over the world right now, particularly in Europe. So you look at the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, Alternative for Deutschland. AfD is now, it's polling anywhere from 13% to 21, 22%, depending if you're in Western or Eastern Germany. And who are they drawing from? They are drawing from the industrial manufacturing base of Germany that's been disaffected by globalization. Corporations don't give a rip about any kind of nationalist loyalty. They don't care about land. They don't care about soil or sacrament. They will sell out communities in a heartbeat if they can get their their factories at a third of the price, or what have you, or their workers at a third of the price. There's a reason why globalization is evidenced what's called a global division of labor, where manufacturing and industry have coalesced around the global south, and finance is coalesced around the urban centers of the global north. And of course, the heartland, the Pennsatuckies, have been left completely abandoned. The Rust Belt is a symbol of what has happened via the changes in globalization. And we have to say, largely at the behest of Republican policies. Yeah, absolutely. Now it's ironically, it's corporatist Democrats who are all for that. And it is Trumpism that's reclaimed the heartland for the Republican Party. So this really, in many respects, is Pat Buchanan's dream come true. He believed that the Reagan Democrats were the future of the Republican Party, and we're seeing a return of them now with Trump.
Yeah, it's difficult to untangle all that, because it's hard to get a straight story when you finally realize that you've only heard one side of the debate your entire life, whether it's liberalism or free trade, and from both political parties. And Pat Buchanan was one of the few, for me, was one of the few voices on the dissident right that said, protectionism is actually a good thing. And that was the first and only person I think I ever heard. And I was so fascinated by this radically contrarian idea. I tried to find other people that criticized free trade, and it was very difficult to find
Right.
any writing on why protectionism and tariffs might actually be a positive thing. It just amazed me, and I started to realize I have really only heard one side of the debate. And is that because the Republican Party and the Democratic Party has embraced this sort of neoliberal globalist outlook after World War II?
Yeah,
And
I think that's exactly it. I think you've got it in the sense what the whole free trade globalistic structure is all about, when all is said and done, is it's a pulling apart of social order from culture. That's kind of the key to understand, I think, what's characterized Western social order from World War II onward, is the pulling apart, the separation of social order, political, economic, demographic, social on the one hand, and culture on the other. And what globalists basically say is that there's a one size fits all, technological, telecommunicative, political, economic system that can then be superimposed on all cultures.
yes,
And then the culture has to learn to adopt to liberal democracy and free markets and lifestyle values and the like. Hello, Iraq. Hello, Afghanistan, right? Hello.
yes,
Now, some cultures have been able to do that in some interesting ways. Japan, for example. But Japan turned around and re-encultured democracy and free markets and lifestyle values and the like. So that if you go to Japan now, they have a thoroughly Japanese version of globalization that is thoroughly protectionist, very protectionist. My wife is from Japan. I've been to Japan several times. Very protectionist in its domestic policies, but it pushes for and lobbies for free trade in its international policies. Same thing we're seeing with China. It's adopting its own form of globalization, but in a radical Chinese kind of way. India's doing the same. Russia's doing the same. So they're turning globalization into a servant of their cultural proclivities. We've been trying to argue since World War II, it should be the opposite. Globalization should redefine cultural proclivities in terms of the economic and political normalcies that the social order brings. And what more and more people are recognizing is this fundamental beginning point where we're going to separate social order from culture. More and more people are recognizing that's a very bizarre culture that does that. In other words, it's simply another form of cultural imperialism being
right.
imposed upon everybody else that requires you to supposedly separate social order from culture. And everyone's recognizing, but that's itself a cultural bias. That's itself a value system, and so on. So,
And people
yes,
resent it. They don't really want to give up their cultures,
and
particularly.
that's the blowback. You got it. And that's the blowback. That's the backlash. That's why the right is so popular right now.
Yes. Now, I want to ask you about this, how this arose, because I just stumbled upon this book called The Globalists, and it's by I think some professor in Harvard or someplace. And I read this review in a liberal publication like The Guardian or something. And I was fascinated by it because it basically said that, as many people have been saying for years, this was all very deliberate, that after World War II, there were groups of people that got together and decided that to prevent war, peace and prosperity, as they say, they were going to impose this neoliberal ideology and regime on the world. And it almost sounded like the John Birch Society or, the Trilateral Commission, and kind of conspiracy idea. But this was a liberal professor writing about the globalists and how this vision with Hayek and all these people that you wouldn't normally think in those terms actually did consciously try to create the institutions that would bring this globalist vision and it was never voted on. Nobody asked for this. Nobody asked for multiculturalism. Nobody asked for mass immigration. It was just decided and kind of imposed on the nations of the West with very little democratic input. Do you have any sense of that? If that's too conspiratorial, or have you seen that yourself?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have too much. Yeah, I tend to see globalization as operating by very logical frames of reference from a devastating World War context, as well as Cold War context. So globalization was also seen as the primary way we could defeat communism, because globalization through its economic processes has something called disembedding. And disembedding basically dislodges the economy from localized control and then relocates it to much more translocal control. The internet would be a perfect example, telecommunications, email, and the like. You can't control globalized dynamics at a local level anymore. And the theory was then that would open up communist societies, which in many ways it did. It certainly did. So I just saw globalization as a very logical movement, and then it entails centralization. So because it involves standardization. So think about air travel. You know, every pilot sounds the same.
Yes.
Right? You could literally think, you know, you could replace every pilot's voice.
They have Chuck Yeager's accent, they say.
Yeah, exactly.
It's Kentucky drawl.
Nice and comfortable and relaxed. Even I was on a plane with a female pilot, and even she had the same inflections, the same like, you know, kind of a kind of a good morning voice, you know, kind of thing. That's standardization. It's a one size fits all. A kind of political, economic, and increasingly cultural protocol for all people, times, and places. Inevitably, that's going to be decided upon, voted on, as it were, within a very, very small cluster of what we call expert systems. Inevitably, that's going to happen. You're seeing it in the EU. This is what caused Brexit, because they recognize that the top leaders in the EU, none of them were voted on. They were all decided in backroom deals and the like. And so in the corporatist structure that is globalization will inevitably take over, centralize, and the like, so that literally the world's political, economic, and cultural structures are ultimately decided on by a very, very tiny minority of people that are not elected.
That's right, but that's a fundamentally anti-democratic ideology, and the question is, was there an attempt to say that, you know, to make this system work, we have to undermine the sovereignty of individual nations through institutions like the IMF and the EU, and through things like mass immigration? We have to weaken people's loyalty to their states, to Germany and to France and so on, and therefore these policies were adopted as part of that, or did it just kind of evolve kind of organically, and that's the world we live in now, you know, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to think it through a bit more, but my inclination is it's a combination of the two. There are just natural dynamics operative in a reconstructed world post 1945 that's going to naturally lend themselves to seeing that as normal. And then there are going to be engineers who are going to tap into that and say, well, you know, but we can hasten it and move it in directions that we want. I think it's a combination of the two.
Okay, go ahead.
If I could chime in, Robert, one of the interesting things is you did have something like what Bertrand Russell and other philosophers were arguing for. They wanted to try to construct something like a value-free language, right? It was a logic-based language that had no ambiguities whatsoever. It was popular in the mid 20th century to think that culture and nationhood and so forth brought all this baggage into purely rational scientific discourse. And if there was a way we can actually abstract the way we communicated with one another in such a way that it was almost completely untainted by religious, cultural, and national sentiments and proclivities. And that was the spirit of the age. We really thought we could do that scientific rationalism really could superimpose itself on all cultures, customs, traditions, religions, and even languages. And I think our elite really have bought into that. And they're getting a very rude awakening that nobody wants anything to do with that.
That's fascinating. Well, let me shift gears for a second and talk about the real core sore points of this whole nationalist question, which is immigration. And obviously, in Europe, people can understand that inviting 1 million Muslim young men into Germany without asking anybody's permission might cause some social disharmony. And so there's been this blowback against that. And people can understand why the Finns might think Finland is for the Finns and France is for the French. But does America complicate this nationalist story? Because not that we are a nation of immigrants, because that's kind of a hackneyed phrase that may or may not actually be true. But
Right.
we are a nation that has many people from many parts of the world. And so to say America is for the Americans isn't really an ethnic question. We have all people from Japan, we have people from, Iran, we have people from all countries. So does America and the America's unique history complicate the nationalist narrative about the importance of culture and national identity and people's sense of themselves as a people? What do you think about that?
No, it's a great question. I think, again, it brings back our good old buddy Pat Buchanan here, who's been one of the finest, I think, most astute theorists on the nature of nationalism from a thoroughly American perspective. You can compare / contrast that with the latest field of studies that have been coming out of Russia of late, because Russia's had to reinvent itself with the fall of the Soviet Union, and it's reinvented itself in a thoroughly nationalist populist sense as well. Russia's a multinational nation, and many people don't recognize that. Have over 100 ethnicities represented in Russia. And so in Russia trying to reimagine what is going to hold this nation together, they lost a third of their nation after 1991 in the fall of the Soviet Union. And they could have kept going there. So the question was, how are they going to be held together? And the answer, ironically, was through a revitalized Russian culture that sees itself as Holy Rus, that sees itself as a culture that invites all cultures to participate in it. Or as Putin would say, we are a nation of nations, a multinational nation. Buchanan was arguing and has been arguing something very similar. He said, we've got, if you think it through, two choices at the civic level. We got this notion that, okay, we're going to abstract these cultural, supposedly culturally neutral political, economic, and cultural social order frames of reference that we're then going to superimpose upon all cultures. And then America's perfect for that because we're all a bunch of different cultures, so we can superimpose this one culturally neutral frame of reference upon it. Or once we expose the fact that that's just another culture in of itself, then we recognize culture is inevitable. There's going to have to be a civic culture in relation to which all other microcultures are going to participate. And the reason why they want to participate in it, because that's a civic culture that provides for them the opportunity to flourish in their own unique ways. Think of the way the Amish have found a home here in the United States. They found a home here in the United States because they found a culture, an overall culture that allows their microculture to flourish. Orthodox Jews found in the United States a culture that allowed their microculture to flourish. Russia's trying to do the same thing. The whole issue there is that at a civic nationalist level, there are going to be symbols, customs, traditions, and indeed religion, like in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church in America, it would be comparable to sort of an Anglican Protestantism. There's going to be a traditional, customary, religious tradition that holds all these micro traditions, micro cultures, micro customs together in a single voice. So what we have to do is we have to think through, what is that culture of America, that singular American culture that holds us all together? Well, obviously it's our flag, it's our national anthem, it's our national symbols, it's our God discourse, God bless America and the like. That is understood, let's be blunt, not from an animistic perspective, but a thoroughly theistic perspective, not even deistic. I think that's even cheating. I don't even see the founding fathers as Aristotelian deists. I see they've got too much Christian baggage coming in there. I think that's just cheating. Let's just come out and say it. It's a theism. It's a thoroughgoing theism, but natural law theism.
Maybe not 100% Orthodox, but certainly,
Right,
yeah.
exactly. Not 100% Orthodox, but the old saying is ideology is clean, history's bloody. Sure, it's gonna be a bloody Orthodox. Let's put it that way. So, what holds us all together? What holds us all together is a unique and very, I would say, very Protestant Christian conception of America, where all religions have found a place to flourish. I'm Orthodox. I think you're Catholic, aren't you, Robert?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So we find we're not necessarily Anglo Protestants here or anything like that, but yeah, we find that there's so much common ground between conservative Catholicism, conservative Orthodox, and conservative Protestantism. In our conservatism, there's so much common ground that we're able to have a very fruitful nation, a very fruitful social order within a distinctively Anglo-Protestant culture.
So you're making a very eloquent and impressive case for civic nationalism, or just good old-fashioned American patriotism that existed for at least a century or more.
Right.
So what has happened recently, though, is that it appears that common culture has broken down, and now people worry that we have bifurcated into separate antagonistic tribal cultures that really don't share that common vision. And how is that part of what's behind the absolute rage of the left at the election of Trump, that Trump is somehow brought to the fore the fact that we don't share a common culture anymore, at least with a large segment of the population that utterly rejects Judeo-Christian values and utterly rejects the kind of common patriotic inheritance that we've the Boy Scout conservatism of the 50s or whatever, and that's why we're at the state we're at right now.
Yeah, you got it. So really we have, and I think again, that's why I find Russia a very interesting counterexample. I think we have two choices where we are right now. With globalization collapsing, whether we like it or not, because modernity has collapsed. Globalization's rooted in modernity. Modernity said there was a one-size-fits-all scientific rationalism that defined politics, economics, and culture for all people's times and places. It's that one-size-fits-all social order that gets put on all cultural systems. That's collapsed. Post-modernity killed it in many respects. So now we value pluralism, but now what are you going to do, right? So if you don't have a very strong civic nationalist vision, then it breaks up into another vision of the right, and that's the ethno-nationalist vision. We're going to the right whether we like it or not. We're going to the right either in civic nationalism, renewed civic nationalism, or we're going to the right in a breaking up and balkanization of ethno-nationalism. The left and its vision of globalist secular modernity is dead. It's just a matter of time before we move in either direction.
Ethno-nationalism would be okay for Europe, but it would be a bad idea for America? Or how do you?
Well, now that's interesting, because so ethno-nationalism in Europe is it's a spectrum. It's a real spectrum. So Sweden, for example, is an extremely multicultural society in many respects, yet nevertheless still held together by a thoroughly sort of Swedish culture, right? A distinctively ethno-Swedish culture that nevertheless can be, for lack of a better term, abstracted or stretched out to include other cultures. Whereas in the Balkans, it was Serbia or not, Serbia or death, Croatia or death, Bosnia Herzegovina or death, they just couldn't live together anymore. There was no longer Yugoslavian umbrella that was able to hold everyone together. So ethno-nationalism is, there's a spectrum to it. What we're finding here in the States is that it's a sort of a take no prisoners, winner take all kind of approach. I like to tell people, I know it's a bit of a paradigm shift, but I would argue that Black Lives Matter is more alt-right than Richard Spencer.
Well, anybody who saw what is it? What was the movie about Wakanda? Black Panther.
Oh yeah, sure,
People often made that case.
You got it. It is more alt-right than Richard Spencer. This whole notion that cultural Marxists, yes, they are, but cultural Marxism isn't going to hold all these different ethno fidelities together. Eventually, they're going to say, wait a minute, I want to rule. I want my own king for my own people kind of thing. That's inevitably going to happen. You're already seeing it in the universities, where
Right.
students are demanding Black-only dorms. And we're starting to see segregation getting put back, but in the name of cultural Marxist social justice. That cultural Marxism is as dead as modernity. What's happening is it's the rise of ethno-nationalism. That's the way you have to see. The media won't report it that way, but that's to me, that's what's happening. So our country, I believe, is really at a crossroads. Are we going to be able to hold together our nation through a renewed civic nationalism that I think Trump is just the beginning of? We're going to see other attempts at it in the future. Or are we going to balkanize, and are we going to break up around ethno-nationalisms? To my knowledge, those are the only two choices that we're seeing. We're seeing that in Europe, we're seeing that in Asia, and we're going to be seeing it here in the United States.
Well, but in Europe, I mean, you could say that, okay, Hungary for the Hungarians, they're going to keep people from mass immigration, they're going to limit mass immigration. That kind of makes sense in a way. In a non-racist sort of way. They simply can say, France is for the French and Finland is for the Finns, and that intuitively makes sense. In America, on the other hand, the balkanization of America into ethnic groups feels much more racist and impractical. So I don't see how that would work here. So I could see how people on the right could support a kind of ethno-nationalism in Europe, in the sense that, that they're all for the National Front in France, but be opposed to it in the United States and be more for a civic nationalism in the United States, because we really are, for either by design or by chance or for good or for evil, a multicultural country, and we have no choice but to live together. I mean, there's
Right. And yeah, keep in mind, when I say we're going to if we don't go with the civic nationalism, we end up balkanizing. No, I see in effect the death of the United States at that point. We're going into a new experiment at that point. It lasted its 230 years and now it's done. Yeah, don't get me wrong. I don't see us still being America with a white state and a black state and a Asian state and Latino. No. That you'll have Mexifornia, it'll fall apart. And that's what, I mean, again, some Russian theorists have been arguing that eventually America is going to break up into 5 different sovereign nations. We'll see. I don't know. We're far off from that, but we are seeing some ripplings there. Keep in mind, too, what's also interesting is even if you have a thoroughgoing ethno-nationalist state, like, say, for example, Japan, you still have a form of civic nationalism within there. Some family is going to have to be the aristocrats there. So some sliver of the race is going to kind of form its own micro race in terms of the hierarchy structures. It's very interesting. So Okinawans, for example, in Japan, can often be considered you're not truly Japanese, or the Tinkers in Ireland. Well, you're not truly Irish. So you even have this strange kind of civic form of nationalism within ethno boundaries. It's really interesting.
But they have, I mean, Ireland is very Irish, and as you say, Japan is civic nationalist, but it's also very anti-immigration. It's very ethno-nationalist as well. So, okay, we only have a couple minutes left. I want to ask you about the elections and what's coming, and practically, and where does your optimism come from? You have such a cheery disposition. This is if we're going to the right, and I agree with you totally, and it's a question of, are we going to be civic nationalists or ethno-nationalists? That seems a somewhat chaotic future. Yet you seem very cheerful. So where does your optimism come from, and where do you see us in the next couple of years after, the rest of Trump's first term going into 2020? What are we going to see, do you think?
Well, so in that order. So, well, first and foremost, my optimism is God is in control. I do not see how you can enter into a renewed nationalist, populist, traditionalist age without affirming a distinctive Christian faith in the Western world. We're not going in as secularists. We're going in as Christians. and a renewed Christian optimism, I think, is a very important thing for us. So that's first and foremost, practically speaking. On the theoretical and evidential level, no, I certainly see the both from the theory and the evidence, we are moving towards the right, towards a far more conservative age. We are going to be looking back and laughing at these cultural Marxists and just, well, hopefully laughing. We may be even enraged in the future looking back at them, 2030, 2050, and the like. Our kids, our grandkids.
Well, I'm old enough. I'm old enough to remember the hippies. So these things come in cycles.
They do. They come in cycles. Exactly right. Yeah. No, you got it. The demographic evidence alone is enough to make you very, very optimistic. Conservative religionists have a 30% fertility advantage over secularists, so much so that demographers such as Eric Kaufman at the University of London are arguing that by 2030, conservative religionists are going to start becoming the majority in the West, starting here in the United States, and then over another couple of generations, even in the Western Europe of all places. Western Europe will no longer be secular Europe. And this is largely because we also have data that finds that the more conservative, say, the more conservative Christian the family, the more the children tend to retain their faith when they become adults as well, upwards of about 80%. As a matter of fact, the worst retention rates are atheists.
Yeah.
Atheist kids tend to grow up relatively religious. Think of, what was it, Madeline Murray O'Hare. Her son grew up to become an evangelical preacher.
Yeah.
So, you know, you look at just the one of my favorite people, Antonin Scalia, you know, the great, the late Supreme Court Justice. Was, a lot of people don't recognize what a wonderful family man he was as well. One of his sons becoming a Catholic priest. So we're seeing a movement of traditionalism here, the likes of which are going to knock our socks off by within about 11 years from now. It's really, and these are secular demographers who are making these arguments. This isn't wishful thinking. These are actually secular demographers saying, actually, it's too late. There's nothing we can do. We're going to end up being nothing more than about 15% of the population. At the end of this.
I've said this. I travel to Europe a lot, and I've said this, that, you know, the churches are packed, allegedly secular Germany and so on. I go to mass in German churches, and they're actually full. And I find America to be much more secularist in the ideology of separation of church and state and all that. And
I agree with you 100%. I saw the same thing in Durham, England, where I went to go to their cathedral. It was packed whenever we worshiped. Yep.
Yeah. What about the demographic realities, though? You brought up demography of religion, but the demographics of, you know, England and a lot of these countries that have had these, you know, the great replacement in a sense. A lot of more pessimistic folks say it's already it's over. They have zero birth rates. They're starting to try and encourage higher birth rates with pronatalist policies and so on, but they're just going to be overwhelmed by the new immigrants, and soon that's just a demographic reality.
That's the irony. So right, this is breathing new life into the pro-life movement in Europe. So pronatal policies, for example, in Hungary and Poland and Georgia, Russia, and the like.
Even France and Denmark.
Even in France and Denmark, actually France has one of the highest fertility rates right now. You got it. They're breathing new life into pro-life sentiments, so that alternative lifestyles and abortion just increasingly look like, well, why would we do that? Why would we kill ourselves, kind of thing? Christians, conservative Christians in the same areas in Western Europe have the same fertility advantages. So, but it's going to take longer because it's a smaller percentage. We have a very large percentage conservative Christian population here, probably around about 20 to 30%. So we've got a bit of a better start than they do in that sense. It's going to take them a couple of generations. In the meantime, ironically, the immigration is making Western Europe more religious, not less. Because, of course, as you know, it's primarily Muslim immigration. And they are coming in not as secularists, they're coming in as Muslims. Yeah. So you're going to see conservative Christianity and conservative Islam beginning to live side by side in Western Europe, not Eastern. Central and Eastern Europe have solved that problem thus far. They've closed the borders. and
Right.
now they're working on their own endogamous population development, fertility. Western Europe, yeah, we're going to see. We're going to see what kind of price they're going to pay for this. But make no mistake, Western Europe 100 years from now will be radically more religious than it is today in that sense. So hopefully favoring the Christian side. That's what we're hoping for because of the demographic fertility advantage. In terms of what's going to happen with Trump and so forth, again, I see Trump as part of nationalist, populist, and traditionalist frames of reference that are not going away. They're growing. They're getting stronger. I think you even start to see them in the Democrat party, like what we're seeing happening in the left-leaning parties in Europe. They're all starting to adopt a pro-border enforcement, anti-immigration policy, some kind of welfare chauvinism. If you're going to be collecting state benefits, you're going to have to be a citizen, that kind of stuff. That's the left talking, particularly like you mentioned in Denmark. I think we're going to start seeing the same thing here. It's just a matter of time. The question is, how frustrated are we going to be to get there? We could see a Pelosi on Tuesday. It's the House is on a knife's edge. We'll see. I'll be doing some posting that night as we're just seeing the returns come in. Senate looks pretty safe. That's that's at least what most are all saying. Trump's popularity is as strong as ever, which is interestingly enough. He's not taken a George Bush hit yet, getting into the low 30s or high 20s in the approval rating. He's still very solidly in the high 40s. So, and I think he'll stay there because I think he's got a new coalition that's very strong, that's very pro-Trump. The more he gets attacked, the stronger they support him. So that's where outside threats end up creating inside solidarity, as it were. I think we're going to continue to see that. I don't think he'll have a problem winning in 2020. He just has the magic of incumbency. You know, we tend to like our presidents for 2 terms, unless they're Jimmy Carter and George Bush Sr. We got rid of those 2, but
Yes.
I mean, you could count them literally. I think they're the only 2 since 1960 that didn't make it to a second term. So I don't think he'll have a problem there. So we're going to have to really and then Republicans tend to have a tremendous advantage, especially at midterms with Congress and congressional districts, if they can maintain that nationalist populism. If they maintain it, then I think we're going to see a whole new paradigm shift in the very near future. If they don't, if they want to play Paul Ryan wussiness, if they want to still play globalist and neocon, they're going to go the way of George W. Bush, and they'll get voted out.
Well, on that happy note, I'd like to bring this to a close. Thank you very much for taking an entire hour to answer all these questions. And
it's my pleasure.
It's been very interesting. And again, I stress that we really do need voices of hope, and yours is one of the best. And you're on every day, right? Or is it twice a day?
Yeah, twice a day. Try to
so,
Monday through Friday.
Anybody who sees this, I really urge you to go check out Turley Talks. It's on YouTube, and you're almost at 100,000 subscribers now.
Yeah, we just hit 80,000 this morning, actually.
80,000 really cool. in what, a year or 2 or something? I mean,
let's see, we've actually it's been 2 years. No, wait a minute. Yeah, 2 years as of the November 1st. I started putting regular videos up the week before the election of Donald Trump, and I predicted he would win. I did that. I can do that better with the president than I can with 500 plus congressional seats. But that's when it started, and so it's been 2 years, and so 80,000. Yeah, it's really wonderful.
What an exciting ride, and I'm grateful, and I've been spreading the word of Turley everywhere, and hopefully you'll grow to 100,000 by the end of the year. So anyway, thank you very much, and I will talk to you later. Okay.
Thank you so much, Robert.
Okay. Here, let me switch this up.